All right, so today we're going to start talking about persistence. Well, we're kind of warming up to persistence. So the idea of keeping data around in between runs of a given program. So typically, I mean, in the end, what we're going to be doing is using databases, but there are lots of other, there are lots of different kinds of databases. So we'll be focusing on relational databases, SQL, but there are there's NoSQL databases. There's basically like, file storage. There are other systems that are basically like giant objects. And there are advantages and disadvantages to all of those different ways of keeping stuff around. But so when for everything we've done so far, you write a function and you generate some value or whatever, and you run it, and then maybe you print it to the console, but that's it. You run the program, and a few milliseconds later, it's done, and all of that stuff that got created is destroyed. So obviously, in the real world, there are all kinds of use cases for wanting to persist data. Anything from if you have a web app and you want someone to log in, so you can keep track of them and sell their information to some third party down the road. You want them to sign up, and then you keep that data, and then the next time they log in, you can check that against your database, right? So as kind of a warm up to that, we'll be looking at CSVs. So again, I wouldn't obsess about learning everything about CSVs. I mean, it's not that complicated, but the goal is not for you to become a master of CSVs. Which screen am I sharing? Let me see. I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. Can you guys see the Readme for today? Okay, was I sharing that before? Oh, all right. Okay, I was sharing my screen. All right, so feel free to take a look at this. We're just gonna work through a couple of examples. So before we jump into CSVs, we're gonna talk about files in general, and then we're gonna talk about the with statement in Python. So we've seen all of this, in passing a couple times. All right, so I'm gonna do a file. Let's see. Okay, so I have a text file with just ordinary text here. And so I can read it, I can open it as a human in my file editor and read it and so on. But if I want to use what's in this file in a Python program, there's basically one main way that you do that. And there's a built-in function called open. So open, and then you pass it a string, which is the file that you want. So in this case, sample.txt. And that's basically it. And that will give us something. We'll see what that something is, but there are a couple other parameters that we'll look at as well, and some other things you might want to do. Well, let's just print my file first. That is not what I want to do. Okay, so when I print out this thing, it's an object. So it's a text IO wrapper object. And if you look at the docs, there's a lot of different layers, but so we have a text IO wrapper. And of course, directly, this is not so useful to us. So if we want to figure out what we can do or what properties this thing has, we can use dir. We can also read the documentation. And we see that there's a whole bunch of stuff. So most of this should look familiar, right? You can delete stuff. It has dictionary, has properties. Dir, you can call dir on it, and so on. We also have this. So what is the iter dunder?
It can be iterated upon.
Yeah. So we know, even though like we still don't know what this is, but we know from calling dir and looking at all of the stuff that it has, we know that we can iterate over it. So we can put it in a for loop. So for something in my file, you could try okay. So I mean, this will actually this works. So we create this file text IO wrapper object, and then we can just iterate it over it directly, and it will somehow magically give us all of the lines one at a time. So that's kind of cool. There's a whole bunch of other things. Let's see, what else do we have? Next, we have this. So this is, I don't think we've seen this one. Enter, we have enter and exit. Maybe we're not quite sure what this, we'll come back to what enter and exit do in a second, but looks like this can do things called enter and exit. So this is, we have a file, we create this object, and then we can iterate over it because it's an iterator. One thing that we don't know off, necessarily off the top of our heads here, just looking at this, is that we should also probably close the file. So if you want to close a file after you open it, you do stuff with it, and then you close it. So this will not look any different, but we've opened it and now we've closed it. So this basically, anytime you open a file, you're also going to want to close it. So there are a few situations in Python, files is the main one, where you're going to want to do these two things every time. So we'll see what enter and exit do, but if you have this pattern where you have to keep doing the same thing over and over again, then oftentimes people will figure out ways to make that pattern a little bit more expressive. All right, so we have this file object. There's a bunch of methods that we can call on it. So close, so we just called closed, in fact, on this. There's things like read line. So let's look at read. So read looks like it gives us the entire contents of the file. So if this were a huge file, this could be a problem depending on how large the file is. But so this is fairly simple, right? So we just read all of the contents of the file. We can also do read lines. So what does read lines give us? Okay, so we get all of the stuff, but it looks like it's an array, and each line is an item in the array. Notice that there's a new line. So probably read lines is using new lines as a way of splitting. So that could be useful too. Of course, we could also just implement this ourselves. We could just read and then maybe loop over it and check for new lines or something like that. Okay. So that's more or less all there is to it. There's also another parameter we can do here. So I didn't pass explicitly a second parameter, but the default is you give it this, it's basically a flag. So you say read. So I want to open a file and I just want to read it, meaning I don't want to write it or anything like that. You can also write if I want to write a new file. So I can have some data. So let's try doing that. And we'll do and I'll go ahead and close it because we should close it. Okay, so I create a new object, a new file object with this. Notice that this doesn't exist yet. New file.txt, and I say, hey, I want this to be, I want to do writing, and then I call this write method just like we called read before. So we can have, we have write here, just like we have read and read lines, we have write lines and so on. So let's see what happens. Okay, so now we get this new file, and there's the text that we added there.
Hey, Chad, I have a question about that.
Sure.
So if you don't put a W or an R and it's a file that doesn't exist in this Python files directory, does it just create it anyway?
Let's try. I'm actually, I don't remember off the top of my head. So new file 2.
Okay.
But speaking of creating a new file, so in addition to read and write, there's also append. So if you do write and the file already exists, it will overwrite what's already there and like basically start fresh. Whereas if you do append, it will just add to the end of the file. All right. So that's, I mean, that really is the basics of file operations in Python. CSV is just one slightly specialized file, but we'll look at that in a sec. So the next thing I want to do is look at the with statement in Python. So this is called a context manager with, and the way it works is you put some kind of expression here. So in this case, we'll put our file. So open, what is it, new file? And I can specify this. We can also give this a name. So right up here, we have this file object and we're assigning it to a variable. Here, it's a little different. It's kind of like imports. When you do import something as, if you want to rename it, right? You can do as my file. And then we can do the same stuff here. So for line in my file, print line. And that gives us what we had before. So why would you do it like this? The answer is, notice that we didn't have to specifically close it. But Python is closing it. So this text IO wrapper object that gets created when you call this, it conforms to the Python API for using a context manager. And that API implements enter and exit, those two dunders that we saw a second ago. So we can actually go ahead and make our own, we actually make our own class that imitates that. So
Chad, do you know
Yeah.
if there's any way to tell like how many, like if you forget to close a file, you know, is there any way you can tell if you have an open file stream anywhere?
You could probably do something like so off the top of my head, I don't know. I'd have to look it up, but I'm sure there's a way you could specify, like look for a file handler. But PS aux will give you all the processes, which, you know, there's obviously a ton. So I can maybe on the break I can
Sure.
take a look. So closing a file is, you know, not gonna like break. If you forget to close it, it's not like gonna break your application. But if you have a long running process and you're constantly creating files and you're not closing them, then you can have issues because you can't have an infinite number of open files. So it's more of like a best practice rather than something that's going to blow up your computer. All right, so let's create a file reader class that will that we'll be able to use in a with statement. So class, yeah. So I think probably one sensible thing we could include when we create an instance would be the name of the file. So we can do that. Okay, and then we have to implement two methods. We have to implement enter and exit. And we know this just because that's the rules. So enter. And enter will be basically, in our case, let's say we want to just create that file object. So we'll do something like, we'll print and then we'll do the sample. Okay, so we're just going to create this open file so we can use it. So it'll be like, that's what this is going to be, basically.
Wouldn't you want to use the file file name from the init?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, you would. That's the whole point of doing that. Okay, so we enter. So basically, once this initial statement executes, we'll have a file object. And when it leaves that with statement, we're going to want to basically do some cleanup. So def. And this takes 3 other parameters, I forget exactly, but it's basically like if there are errors. So we're not going to worry about errors right now, but I'm going to call them ABC because I don't remember the names right now. So we'll kind of just ignore these, but you can also handle errors here. In this case, we're just going to do self.open file, and we'll do a print statement. All right, so I think that should be good. So let's go here and let's try importing it. And we'll do with, we'll pass it the name of the file. Let's just do pass for now. So notice that both of those methods got called, right? So this executes, this statement executes, it enters, and then it finishes and it falls through to the end. So the enter and the exit got called. So that's basically it. I mean, it's basically like just a hook. So when something starts, you do something. When something at another point, you do something else. We can do the same thing. So let's print my file. Again, this is a text IO wrapper because that's what we're doing here. And let's do for so I mean, we're basically just reinventing the wheel, but this is what's happening. So you can, like anything in Python, using these dunders, as long as you follow the rules or the API or the protocol, you can make your own objects that will work with the context manager, the with statement. Okay, so that's all the with statement is really doing. It's just making sure that the enter and the exit dunders get called. Okay, so that's the basics of just files. So let's talk about CSVs now. So we'll go, I mean, here's an example of a CSV. It's just a text file. So, it's called .csv, but it's really just a text file. And there's a convention, right? It's not enforced. It's not enforced by, if you try to save something as a CSV file and it's all messed up, it's not going to throw you a warning or anything, as I'm sure many of you know. So these can be very badly formatted, but it's just, the idea is that this is like a database, like a column. These are columns in the database. And then these are rows. So this, you can almost think of them as instances. So if we have like, teams, so this is a team, this is a team or a record, right? So here's a spreadsheet. This is where CSVs often come from. So we have a spreadsheet. You can also export CSVs from databases, you can import CSVs into databases, but spreadsheet is a very common source for CSVs. So this is fine, and we can, as a human, we can look at this, and maybe we can write some macros or whatever. But if we want to use this in a Python program, we'll need to export it. So I'm going to download this as a CSV file, which I've already done here. So I'll bring that in. I'm going to rename this. Well, let's say .csv, and here's what that looks like. That spreadsheet looks like as a CSV file. So you have all of the column names up top. This is not strictly necessary, but this would be the typical example, and everything is just separated by commas. So if we want to read in a CSV file, we could just use normal Python file, right? So actually, we'll use the with statement since we know that now. We'll do something like that. And then so just like any other text file, we can read the CSV file. So it's not really that special. It's just a conventional format. So if we wanted to parse through this, typically this is not the most useful. This is not how you would really use a CSV file. So we could maybe try, let's do read something like this. Maybe we could try looping over and splitting by new lines. So for, call this text. All right. Maybe I should do read lines. All right, so we'll do it this way. And then we could further loop over this again, and we could split it, let's say, on commas. So for right, so you could go through, and again, we could do all this stuff by hand if we wanted to, but like is often the case, this is a very common task. So people have basically packaged this common stuff up into something for the standard library. So Python in the standard library has a CSV module or library, and we can use that. So rather than doing all this, let's do we'll import CSV, and then, but the basic structure is going to look exactly the same. So with open CSV file. But instead of calling just like read, you're going to have to invoke it on the CSV object. So CSV dot, we'll do reader. And we're going to have to pass it this file object. And we'll iterate over that. Let me get all this. So this is, a bit nicer, right? It's kind of packaged up in a way that makes sense for what you're typically going to do with a CSV. So this is a normal kind of reader. There's another reader, which is called a Dict Reader. So here we're getting a bunch of arrays, right? So every line in the CSV file is an array. We can do something so that we get dictionaries instead, which may be more useful depending on what you're doing. So we'll call the Dict Reader, CSV's Dict Reader. And then instead of arrays, we get a bunch of objects. And notice the key is the column. So every order date, every region, every rep, and so on. Okay. And so in addition to reading, so let's just go back to the reader, the regular reader. You can also write. So let's change this around. And I'm gonna need to adjust this. So this will be, make this append. So then I will do writer, and then there's a bunch of methods on this writer object. Well, let's print this out first. So it's a writer object. And we can see what methods are available. Okay, a bunch of standard stuff, and then we have write row and write rows. So let's go ahead and write a row. And we'll pass this in iterable. So we'll pass it. And it really doesn't matter, again, because there really aren't any like rules enforced here. I don't know if I actually ran it. Okay. So the first time, so I didn't have a new line here, but so that got appended to the end. If I run this again, you can see. There we go. And we can just keep appending over and over and over and over again.
Dad, what did you say was the difference between writing and appending? Is it just one goes to the end and one goes to the beginning?
Yeah, so if you append, then whatever whatever you're adding will just start at the very, basically where your cursor is at the end of the file. Whereas if you do write, it will start fresh. So if we wrote to this file, it would basically delete the file and then start over. Okay, so this is the normal writer. So we have like a normal writer and then a normal reader. There's also the Dict Reader. There's the Dict Writer. So the Dict Writer, instead of passing an array, we're gonna have to pass it a dictionary. There's one other catch though. We have to tell it what the column names are. And that's called field names, the field names keyword. And you can pass that in iterable. We'll use an array. And it's going to be order date, region, rep, item, units, unit cost, total, and then I'm gonna copy this because I don't want to write all that. And then we actually do this. Okay, so I'm just going to change this so you can see. So the difference between, I mean, it's all basically the same. You can look at the documentation. It's all just details, but the basic structure is the same. You're going to use the with, the context operator, the context manager, to open the file. Since we're writing it, we'll be in append mode. We could be in write mode. We're gonna create this writer object. In this case, it'll be a Dict Reader from the CSV standard library. And we'll pass it in the file object that we have. We created up here. And we also need to give it a keyword argument of field names. That'll be all the columns. And then if we want to write a row, we just give it a dictionary. So we can do this, and that should work. Simple. So we get this new entry here. So both of them work. It's kind of in just, it depends on whatever the needs of your application, whatever is easier, and so on. So both of them kind of do the same thing. So that is really all there is to it. It's just a matter of looking through the documentation and doing it a couple times to get familiar. Greg, what is that art in your background?
Oh, it's like a painting that one of my friends did, and about one of the prints of it.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Chad?
Yeah.
Could you show us what happened? Like if you say we misspelled one of the names, like region, say we made it regions or something like that. If we get an error or, yeah.
I am not sure. Let's see. Yeah. So here, yeah, this contains fields not in field names. So I'll probably get the same error.
Okay, but what if you what if you mess up the region or whatever, or one of them in the field names variable and in the right row?
Like
Yeah, yeah. What happens with that?
it should work. Let me delete this. We'll do it again. Yeah, because it's not really checking. It's not really checking what's up here. So yeah, and CSVs, I mean, in terms of like data integrity, CSVs are not the state of the art. It's one reason why we have databases. You can do all kinds of checking, type checking. Another thing to note is that all of this stuff is text. So even though we have, dates and floats and integers and maybe normal strings here, it's all going to be a string. So so if we read stuff in, we might read in all kinds of, complex stuff, types, but when we pull it out, all we have is strings. So that's also something to keep in mind. So let's write a quick example. So we have this CSV file with a bunch of sales, sales stats, sales receipts, sales records. So let's write a class. We'll call it account manager. And let's think of what the account manager. So the idea is here's all of the data from our sales, and we're trying to, I don't know, we're doing business analytics or whatever. So we need to pull out something useful from this. So we can write a class that does that for us. So what information would we find useful?
The average of unit costs, or
Okay. Sounds good. Average of unit cost. So let's write an account manager class, and we can imagine this as a whole bunch of other things, but we'll just write that one method. So first thing I'll do def all right, so if I create an instance, is there anything else that you guys think? I mean, how should we go about doing this? So we are going to need to somehow get the information from the CSV file.
import CSV.
Okay. So I would imagine that before we're able to do any kind of analysis, we're going to have to get the data. So we're probably going to have to, we're going to have to get the data somehow. So how can we pull the data from the CSV file?
With open,
Okay.
and then the file.
We're going to need a method that does that. So let's do so we can do with open
sample.csv.
Okay. So we definitely could hard code this, but let's imagine that this is, we want this to be a reusable application.
Then we need an init.
Okay. So init. Self. So what should, John, what should the init take?
You should probably pass it the file name, I guess, and then you could do set file name equals, or self.file name equals file name.
Okay. All right, so now we create an instance. So I'll just to have this over here. So and I'll pass it in. Okay, that's what that's going to end up looking like. So we get a file name and then getting the data. So we could do open self.file name. Give it something usable as so our goal here, yeah.
Maybe you're gonna have to store the data somewhere, so you need to add another variable to the init, or you're gonna return it. Those are two options at this point. So
sure. Yeah, we could do either one. So let's do. I guess none so far. Maybe. Yeah, it's a few different ways of handling that.
I mean, I guess you could just pass the object into that, and then whatever you want to do, it can use the data as it wants instead of trying to read all the data in at one time. Can't you pass the object handler, and then it can pull data as it needs it, or other options to read it all in, I guess.
Yeah. So
I'm not even sure what kind of data we're passing here. So yet, so
it's this. It'll be this.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess then we can pick either a dictionary or a array to store it in and get it off the file and into memory and then manipulate it from there.
Okay. So yeah, I think, yeah, we'll just do it. We can read it all into memory. We haven't really talked about generators or anything yet. So let's read it into memory. So let's do Dict Reader, and we'll pass it in. What do we call this? CSV file. Hopefully I didn't delete that. Yes. Actually, I don't know if we need that for the reader.
Yeah, I think you can either declare the file, the field names, or you can pull them in and just, there should be a flag to set the first one, or I might be thinking of pandas, something entirely different, so.
Yeah, there might be, yeah, in pandas, I think there's probably more, something more advanced, but that's fine. So we'll do this for now, and then we can return so the one issue is that, yeah, as you mentioned, so the first one is actually going to be this. So we'll do this so far, and then we'll see what we get. So if we want to return an array of objects or array of dictionaries, we can do this. So we want this to be self.data. So let's try running this. So we have an array of dictionaries now, but notice that the first one is kind of wonky. So one thing we do here is we can use enumerate. So we'll just skip the first one. And now we have just what we want here. Okay, so
Totally separate topic. Can you explain that line again as I try to understand higher order functions and list comprehension better?
sure. Yeah, so Dict Reader. So Dict Reader will return an iterable. So it's something that can be iterated. So it will act like an array. You can loop over it. And so what we're doing here is, so this is an iterable that's going to be a bunch of dictionaries. So what we're saying here is we want to create an array that has all of those dictionaries in it. So this record is going to represent each one of these dictionaries. So we're saying put a record in this array, basically like append a record to this array for every record in reader if the index is not 0. That's basically what we're doing. So enumerate will get you a tuple or tuple of the index and then the value. And,
Okay, that makes sense. I wasn't getting I as the index there.
Yeah.
As soon as you said the word index, then it all made
Okay.
It decrypted what you just typed for me. Thank
Sorry.
you.
Yeah, so this is the index and then the value. Kind of like a key value pair in the dictionary in some ways. Okay. So one other thing that I want, so we've talked about decorators, we've seen a couple. One, you don't have to do this, but just to introduce, so you could do something called, use a property decorator here. And if we just call this data, we get the same result. So this is just another way of doing this in Python. You don't have to use this, but I just want to introduce that as another option. So it'll treat, even though this is a method, Python will treat it like it's in just a regular attribute. So you don't have to call it. So data, when I access it here, I just access it as though it were an attribute.
So it just kind of takes out that middle step of calling it and returning it. It just does both.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's just a minor, it's more of a stylistic thing. Okay, so getting the average cost. All right, so we have, let's say we have an array of dictionaries and we want to get the average cost.
Jed, can you just say one more time, on line 12, is the field's name, was that optional? I thought that we didn't use that in the reader.
Yeah, I don't think you need, I think I put that in there unnecessarily. And then probably we don't need to do this first thing. Let me check this. Yeah. So I was creating and then solving a problem by doing that. So you can simplify this.
So as part of the CSV library, it knows that the first line should be the key.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. There are when you're writing, if you're writing and you're starting from scratch, you'll need to specify when you're writing like the column names. But yeah, when you're reading, yeah, that was just me getting a little mixed up. So
What if the field names are in the first column instead of the first row?
if the field names are in the first. Sorry, can you say that one more time?
What if the field names are in the first column instead of the first row? So if this was basically if the whole thing was flipped on the side.
Oh, you'd have to do some pre-processing. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's a built-in way of handling that in the CSV library. Maybe someone's just trying to torture you by inputting data that way.
So you talk about like the first column, each row is like one of these attributes, and then each record is a column.
Yeah, so like order, date, region, rep, item. Yeah, I mean, you would definitely be able to handle that. I mean, but I don't know if there's pandas. I mean, pandas would be more likely to have something like that. You just kind of switch the axis or something. Okay, so let's get the average cost here. Any thoughts? So we have, again, we have a list of dictionaries, and we want to grab one field, unit cost, right? So unit cost from all of them, total it up, and then get the average.
For unit costs in record.
Okay, let's do for, so we can go ahead and iterate it. So let's go ahead and make sure we can access every single record. So for record in self.data, let's print the records.
You never call data.
Sorry, thank you. So I need to call average. Yeah. Okay. So now we can access each one of these.
So for record brackets, unit costs.
Yeah, so here we're iterating and we're getting all of these one at a time, right? So here's the first one, here's the second one, here's the third one, here's the fourth one. And the only thing we care about is unit cost, right?
Yeah, can't we just, so that's a key. Can't we just grab the value of that key?
Yeah. So let's try just print record. Okay. So now we have all of the unit costs here.
So we'll want to catch those unit costs either in an array or as a number that keeps getting added to it.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll call it accumulator. Start at 0, and then maybe we can add to the accumulator. Anyone have any final words?
Is it in a string format currently in the record?
It is, yeah. So even though this looks like a bunch of floats, because we're pulling it from a CSV, it's just strings. So if we run this, we're trying to add an int and a string, and in Python, you're not allowed to do that. So we can convert this. That works, doesn't return anything, but this should be the value. And then, so we want to return the average. Accumulator divided by
Length.
Okay. I'll have to print this. So 8.5 something. All right, so yeah, so we started with this CSV file and we read it in. So we read it into our Python program. So now all of that stuff we have in a form that Python can use, and then we can just treat it like any other Python object. With one, I guess, caveat that everything will be a string unless you convert it. So are there any questions about that?
Is this the preferred method in Python, regardless of like the file size, or is there?
Yeah, so it depends on how big the file you're reading is. You'd want to use a generator if you had a large file. So here's where we're actually putting everything into memory all at once. So you might not, depending on what you're doing, that may or may not be a problem, but just something to be aware of.
Because of what we talked about Tuesday with keeping the different methods kind of separate and doing their own thing, you wouldn't want to do, you wouldn't want to open and close the file within another method.
Yeah, I mean, you could, I'm sure there's a use case, but since this is kind of the basic information that we need, I think here it makes sense to put it in its own method, handle it separately. All right. So you can take a look at the README. You can see all of the options. So we mostly use like read, write, and append. There's a couple other ones. And then the challenge for today is word guess. So you're going to get something that's pre-built, and you're just going to need to modify it to read from a CSV. Okay, that's all I got for now.